The After-Death Journal of an American Philosopher, The Worldview of William James, by Jane Roberts, introduction by Seth, read by Martin John. Four. What does truth mean? Science and Religion. Wednesday morning, February 16, 1977. The animals do not have governments, possibly because they do not have possessions as men do, or tools to defend them with. In nature, the animal is his own possession, and his body is at once his life and his tool for protecting it. Men consider possessions to be extensions of themselves, so that no possession is neutral but a symbol of its owner. And so strongly has this principle been embraced that property is often treated according to law as being equal value to life itself. Governments are based upon man's attitudes toward three main issues: his concept of the individual, the value of his life, and the value of his property. While official religion can be separated from the seat of government, man's ideas and beliefs about his mind and soul cannot. Physically, a country is the joint property of its people, at least in legal and political terms. Dictums such as "the survival of the fittest" or "might is right" emphasize the most obvious instances of seeming inequality among men, justify the fiercest competition in all areas of private and public life and between nations, and visualize government as the natural human extension of nature's own cruel weeding out process as perceived through evolutionary dogma. Signs of animal cooperation and biological graciousness are ignored or minimized. Yet whenever man downgrades the animals or the gods, he minimizes the dimensions of his own consciousness, since his existence lies so obviously between the thematic structure of those seeming opposites. In past centuries, man's relationship with the animals involved him in a practical give and take with other species. Man and animals worked the land together, and the daily life of man was intimately connected with that of other creatures. Now, in your time, such a rift has developed that to the urban populations in industrial areas of the world, animals become absent, almost theoretical species, as removed from the land and daily life as the hypothetical existence of the gods. Other species lose their practical immediacy, then, and become subjects of hypothetical and theoretical discussions. They become less real to man. Their existence may be scientifically investigated, their habits explored, and their haunts exposed, but this kind of objective investigation itself destroys the sense of basic interrelationship among the species. Such an approach results in the gaining of information, but the loss of knowledge, the accumulation of particular details, and the diminution of the overall living picture in which the specific conditions exist. If man does not relate emotionally to the natural world and its creatures, then his information concerning them becomes anti-information in that it provides facts. It also evolves a framework in which those facts become ultimately valueless. It is no coincidence that the theories of evolution emerged to full flower just as man began to lose his emotional rapport with other species and began replacing it with the objective accumulation of facts. When, in other words, he began to examine animals if they were primarily objects. I was a great proponent of scientific investigation and advocated the freeing of man's imagination and curiosity from the old religious and superstitious dictates of the past. I thought that science could explore mind and matter, soul and body, emotions and intellect. Instead, it chose to deny what it could not explain, dismissing mind, soul, and the emotions not only as subjects of inquiry, but as realities in themselves. They were considered as inexplicable byproducts in the struggle for survival, or as imaginative posturings or mental pretensions. Yet those same subjective phenomenon are what distinguish man as a species, and therefore should have been science's concern. Wednesday afternoon, February 16, 1977. Freudian psychology and evolutionism were not sciences as such. For that matter, with the possibility of provable results in a series of experiments, but a group of hypotheses that basically could not be proven. Nor did Freud's psychoanalysis produce a body of case histories in which cures could be definitely shown to result from Freudian techniques. Neither can man prove the non-existence of the soul, yet science treated the soul as if it had been proven to be non-existent. I hope to prove the opposite by looking into man's experience for hints of an overriding ability not dependent upon senses or other physical mechanisms alone, or for an over-perception that operated in spite of the senses' seemingly confinement to the immediate environment. I was personally convinced that such hypothesis came closest to the truth about man's position. Again, as a scientist, however, I was careful to distinguish between belief and hypothesis, though many of my colleagues on the opposite side of the fence were not so scrupulous. Even now, having been a scientist to the best of my ability, I hesitate to offer my own objective continuing reality after death as any kind of objective proof of survival, in your world's terms. Indeed, I shall not do so, but will rely instead upon those arguments, persuasions, and methods with which you are familiar, only honed to such a degree that their vigor alone, I hope, will express the soul's valor and give evidence of its heroic nature. That is, I hope to show the heroic and extra-dimensional characteristics of human creativity, to demonstrate that evidence of these is available in physical life, and to suggest that it is at least possible to project these as existing apart from the physical organism. Moreover, perhaps in an excess of enthusiasm on my part and the overestimation of my readers' concern, I hope at least to state the case for an alternate hypothesis for science to follow. It is not new and has been held to some extent or another throughout the ages, though clothed in superstition and misunderstandings and held static by bonds of dissension. It is a hypothesis based on the existence of a non-physical soul or entity that provides inner direction, that emerges into time and space and exists, and on the projection of this soul or entity as being within all species to whatever extent, directing the overlife of the planet, and with cooperation rather than competition as the basic dictum. To me it seems now obvious that the newness ever entering the world is proof of an inner source existing beyond all known biological mechanisms or organic organizations, and that the orderliness of organisms' intricate forms make their accidental creation a logical contradiction. Yet in life, out of a misguided sense of duty to science, I seriously considered the possibility of a chance creation, thus wasting a good deal of effort on an absurdity. Yet the very absurdity speaks of the creative abilities of the men who conceived it, and it is through those abilities that I believe a kind of evidence can be presented for the survival of man's consciousness beyond death. Those creative abilities must be exercised, however, and Freudian and evolutionary theories have to some extent blinded men to their own capabilities, and limited the extent to which the living consciousness itself can perceive the greater reality in which it exists. That vaster reality does not simply spring into being at death. It is the medium in which life happens. Living momentarily supersedes it, even while subsisting in its source. The everyday world is one in which living men have their experiences, and of course it is science's province to explore that world, make it more comprehensible and predictable. Yet the thoughts scientists hold about physical reality are themselves non-physical. They cannot be piled like stones on a laboratory table, and even to the scientist his thoughts must appear transparent and lacking all of those qualities of solidarity that otherwise exist in the phenomenal world. The same, of course, applies to the scientist's dreams. No matter how vividly in sleep he perceives the images of friend, lover, dog, ocean, or mountain, these images nowhere exist as solid either in his head or in the bedroom in which he rests, or in any of the classified realms covered by his waking investigations. Yet the scientist, like any man, responds. And if he is honest with himself, he recognizes how subtly yet surely these dream images affect his waking life. Physical creature or not, man is everywhere in his subjective experience reminded of a non-physical reality that ever impinges into the most intimate portions of his physically oriented life. The objects of his perception should be categorized, arranged in predictable patterns when possible, a worthy pursuit on science's part, yet those objects cannot be honestly considered without an equal investigation into the non-physical properties of mind that give the object their appearance and solidity. For while the physical world is operationally predictable, and then only generally speaking, that predictability is operative only when inner components of the mind act upon physical properties in a certain very precise fashion. The physical world must be turned on. Only then does it appear with its predictable elements. Only then do objects have reality. Flowers grow, seas turned with their tides, and the splendid sun's heat warms the land. So far, science has only examined results. By its insistence upon the priority and superiority of matter's dominance, it ties its own hands. The very focus of its beliefs leads it toward an endless categorizing in which it follows minute particles into a deepening invisibility. The hypothetical discovery of each new minuscule particle exerts an ever-depending hypnotic effect, leading the scientist down a road that is self-defeating if he hopes to delve into those phenomena that exist beneath the world's operating reality. The mind, so entranced by these matters, so led astray, itself possesses the abilities to perceive the inner structure of life, but in a different fashion. The old methods of measurement do not apply to a non-physical reality. Yet the mind has its own values, its own methods and measurements, and the mind's very existence is its own evidence. To that evidence, science remains blind. The scientist often says impatiently, "I deal with the true or false world. A phenomenon exists or it doesn't. An object is or isn't. I deal with provable facts." This attitude alone shuts out from science's province the very unpredictability, the very creativity from which the predictable world emerges. Modern science rightly rebelled against the excesses, exaggerations, and superstitions of religion and against a rigid system of beliefs that encouraged man to interpret the natural world only in the light of its own dogmas. Yet science went overboard to prove itself, adopting many of those authoritative characteristics and denying the existence of any phenomenon that is not observable according to its own set of limited measurements, or that does not agree with its basic theories. In whatever erroneous a fashion, however, religion did attempt to categorize inner realities, for it numbered its species with as much vigor and self-righteousness and determination as any scientist pinpointing the number and kinds of rocks, birds, gases, or particles. The demons, minor gods, mythological creatures, hells and heavens were all in their way the result of this same kind of specification, misapplied, for in the inner reality such methods are ludicrous. Both religion and science seek truth, but the literal interpretation of physical reality is as limiting as the literal interpretation of the Bible. There are fundamentalist scientists quibbling over whether the universe is forever expanding or is endlessly expanding and contracting, and that is as much an exercise in futility as medievals debating on how many angels can sit on the top of a pin. The attitudes of mind, the childish literal interpretations are the same, equally absurd, if the greater issue of truth is to be involved. The very definitions of truth are at fault. Science and psychology owe their birth to religion's failure in conducting that search for truth. They are split-offs from religion, each with their own methods, yet they have to a large extent converged. For all of psychology's stated interest in man's subjective nature, held while still maintaining its basic objective stance, psychology is depending more and more upon technology and scientific instruments to measure the mind's products and its behavior. a new futility also perpetuated because of limited concepts and misunderstandings concerning the pursuit of truth itself. For what does truth mean? In scientific terms, it means a provable fact such as today is Wednesday or an apple is a fruit. These facts are operational. One categorizes time and the other an object. Neither tells us anything about time or objects, however. In fact, the belief that today, Wednesday, is followed by Thursday, while operationally true, also leads to drastic misconceptions about the nature of time itself, couching it in the constructive terms of everyday experience. This discrepancy goes quite unnoticed when you meet a friend for a Wednesday appointment, and the convenient use of time is to be maintained in any orderly physical world. Scientists know, however, that time is relative, and if the dictum "time is relative" is a fact or truth, then is the fact of consecutive time true or false? If false, then no day is Wednesday, whether the statement is operationally true or not. For that matter, Wednesday does not exist in the same way that our apple does. In that regard, the statement that an apple is a fruit is the truer of the two statements. But even the apple's fruitness tells us nothing of the origin of fruits, or explains how the apple has fruit rather than animal characteristics, and no matter how far you go with this kind of truth-finding, you will ultimately be led to a point where one fact contradicts another, or another framework of facts, or where you simply run into ignorance, a point of no answers. The reason is astonishingly simple. The overemphasis upon categorization leads to an infinitely larger and ever-increasing number of facts, each considered true, and with this multiplication, the discrepancies collected along the way also multiply. You end up with the various disciplines, each with their fact-truths, and under examination the facts of one discipline too often do not apply to those of another field. A fact that those in all disciplines often conveniently overlook. With any one school of knowledge, these discrepancies are invisible, and overall people operate in a fairly predictable environment regardless, eating delicious apples and secure in the knowledge that each Wednesday is followed by a Thursday. It should serve no purpose, either, to say that apples are not fruits, a statement that is false if you accept the apple's fruitness. But the truth or falsehood of such statements are besides the point of basic truth, which should deal with the innate nature of time or with the innate nature of objects rather than with their specifics. Under what conditions is an apple a fruit or a chair a chair? Under what conditions do we experience time as Wednesday or as a series of consecutive moments? And under what conditions might time behave otherwise? Do any of these phenomena exist independently of our perception of them? How is it that dream objects mock physical objects so well, even satisfying all of those senses during the experience, while nowhere appearing in time or space? We may be involved in the most ecstatic or horrifying dream experience. our bodies thrashing in our bedclothes, or immersed in the sweetest relaxation. We may be responding to perceived snakes or angels, or even participating in battle. Yet in life, we assign more reality to the bedside clock than we do to the dream experiences that seize our emotions, excite us to a frenzy, or fill us with profound peace or dismay. In waking life, the same applies. Scientists assign reality to the objects of their experiments and to the technological tools they use, yet none to the mind with its thoughts, the same mind that assembled the tools from realms of the imagination that nowhere appeared in given fact terms. It is for this reason that the inner dimensions of events appear so obscure. The psychological thickness invested by the mind in phenomena is completely ignored, for in science's realm only the brain is granted reality. Thursday afternoon, February 17, 1977. Religion finally failed as an organized belief system by which to judge and structure practical experience. Let science beware of falling into the same trap. Science is twice as vulnerable, in that some of its less fortunate results threaten men with a physical destruction far more immediate than religion's threat of an afterlife hell. Moreover, a possible holocaust in which the entire world is destroyed by the hand of God is one thing to the common man. The same destruction brought down unnecessarily upon man's head by the misuse of science is quite another. The common man will undermine science in the most insidious ways before he will permit it to destroy the world it is supposed to be exploring. Science is uneasy with the human personality and ignorant of basic motivations. While science produces, the common man will sit back for the expenditure of almost endless funds for scientific purposes. But let him decide that science has served its purposes. Let him be convinced that science serves only science and is willing to sacrifice even planetary life to satisfy bloated, neurotic appetites, and the common man will close off funds, foundations, and grants with unbelievable rapidity, and science will survive as religion has, splintered, robbed of its fury, thunder, and effectiveness. The fallibility of science, as practiced, becomes increasingly obvious and does immeasurable disservice to science, which should investigate all expressions of life and consciousness equally and open-mindedly, including men's values, ascertaining which of them add to the quality of life and which do not. Science could not afford to invent weapons of incalculable degree while divorcing itself from the study of moral values or the rights of consciousness. Friday morning, February 18, 1977. Faith does not fall within the realm of science. Yet faith in God or man or nature is imperative, or all of the facts of science are meaningless, collected paraphernalia, the categorizing of chaotic shafts of chance, without dignity, a kind of obsessive blind numbering of events within a universe in which events themselves, men and animals alike, are playthings of a mechanical process without intent. Man can suffer even tragedy better, believing in the malevolent intent of a capricious fate, than he can bear happiness in a universe without meaning, stripped of all the heroic elements that are a part of his psychological heritage. He can at least grit his teeth and show contempt for fate if he believes that it controls his life. But a meaningless universe leaves him no retort. Those systems of belief that nourish such nonsense find themselves in an impossible dilemma and ultimately defeat themselves. For those who follow such hypotheses find no reason to continue living. Inertia overcomes them. The theories are not life-giving. They lack strength and so die out. It is more than possible, however, that the meaning of the universe cannot appear within the measurements of logic alone, and that the very mental techniques used in logical thought, the categorizing, the precision and separating, the searching for cause and effect, may themselves break up an overlying unity in which that meaning might otherwise make itself known. You can study the techniques used in any painting, musical composition, poem, or other creative work, understand perfectly how certain strokes or vowels or notes add up to specific effects, and yet be ignorant of the meaning within the entire work of art itself. The artist in any field uses the techniques of art, yet puts them together in a completely different fashion than a technician, say, combines the components of an electronic tube. The preciseness and predictability that work for technology and the productions of practical industry are the results of a remarkable specialization. The analytical powers of the mind honed and tuned toward results that work. I do not mean to diminish the importance of such attitudes or methods in any way. Those same methods, however, do not give results, say, in terms of art, but produce only the dreary renderings of robots or finger paintings. For in art, the elements of surprise and unpredictability reign within a certain framework, however. Techniques are used, mediums and supplies, but they are used in a completely different mental and emotional context, in which art's meaning is often nowhere specifically apparent but felt and emotionally perceived. Indeed, the senses are appealed to in a different fashion. This is a highly important point. So here I would like to briefly compare the universe to a model of a multidimensional work of art, rather than, say, to a mechanical machine whose components, examined, will inevitably yield an understanding of its parts and overall purpose. If we use this analogy, however, comparing the universe to a work of art, we must also say that it is a work of art in progress, for changes occur in it constantly. We must further ascribe to this art a multi-sense appeal, granting it an aesthetic plan beyond any utilized by a human artist. The composition includes all the elements of reality as we know them. The glasses are not just described in words as they might be in literature, or painted, or evoked through musical notes, but they combine the techniques of all the arts and go beyond them. The grasses appeal to all our senses. Their color is not just painted on, but ever rushing into their tender tips, ever changing hue and value while staying within color of a certain order. While alive, we are within this creative production ourselves, of course, and all of the categorizing in the world will not reveal its meaning. A different framework of thought itself is required, one that is similar to the creative processes, for there are different kinds of logic. If building a radio component is your goal, then objective thought is scientific and produces results. If creating a poem or a sonata is your intent, then this other kind of intuitive thinking is equally valid and equally scientific, leading to results just as surely. Here, unpredictability can almost be considered a predictable working method. The meaning of the universe may exist in this other framework, remaining invisible to the usual kind of scrutiny and actually becoming less apparent the more it is examined in a conventionally scientific, objective manner. The same applies to the individual person within that universe. No information, however extensive, pertaining to the body or the brain will result in an answer to that question. What is the meaning of a person? Not only that, but the methods of investigation, the naming and counting of separate components, and the tracing of circuits may make the information itself so misleading as to turn it into anti-information, as defined earlier, data yielding results that diminish knowledge. I'm not implying that such understanding is beyond man's comprehension, only that it is beyond the methods mistakenly used to achieve it. And I am suggesting that there are at least two contexts in which perception and knowledge happen. Friday afternoon, February 18, 1977. Thinking of man or the universe as a machine and using this as a model presupposes certain hypotheses regardless of how far we extend the machine's abilities. But most of all, we do not instill the powers of true spontaneity, basic creativity, or unpredictability into such a model. We do not see, using straight objective thought, how a creative intuition can come seemingly from nowhere. So we can hardly understand a universe springing out of nowhere in each moment, at each point of its reality. Instead, we limit our model to one familiar to objective thought and also limit our hopes of comprehension, because such a model is in its way the result of schizophrenic behavior. It is a model produced by only one half of the brain, a one-sided model, as much limited as vision is when only one eye is used. We lose depth perception that makes all the difference. In a manner of speaking, religion uses the other eye or side of the brain more than science does. In its determination to relate to the everyday world, however, religion made the same fatal mistake in its realm that science makes. It tried to turn creative truth into literal fact. Again, its endless catalogues of demons, fallen angels, levels of spiritual worlds, gods and lords of the universe are often ludicrous attempts to enforce a particular kind of order over inner realities so as to correlate them with the world of facts. Hence, fundamentalist religious insistence upon literal interpretation of the biblical creation of the world, and so a battle between science and religion on a matter in which both eventually will be losers. The literal interpretation of the Bible's rendition of events and science's insistence upon Darwinian facts are alike besides the point. Darwin's considerable achievement in perceiving the interrelationship of creature, species, and environment was entirely misinterpreted. His cataloging of effects led him to perceive only competitiveness and made him blind to the basic cooperative ventures existing between species and between creatures and their environment. The same set of facts could have been read quite differently. Darwin himself felt the conflicts. He believed in them, projected them upon his own work, and was tortured by a misconception about his own contribution. He personified the various species with the most regrettable of human characteristics, seeing murder and conflict instead of the inner balances worked out by the various species themselves. For other kinds of consciousness may well be as individually tuned as ours, but also available to leapfrog their own apparent death in a series of biological computations that completely escape us, particularly when we behold nature through the one part of our minds that is least intuitive, least willing to leave the ideological home of objectivity. Darwin's work took for granted a certain hypothesis about consciousness that, scientifically, we have no right to take as fact. While denying animals a dignified consciousness of any variety at all, he still projected upon them man's worst tendencies. It was man's sense of the survival of the fittest that was projected upon the natural world, and not the other way around. There is no reason why the existence of the soul cannot be a scientific hypothesis, but science itself must learn how ridiculous it is for the scientist to ignore his own nature, his emotional and subjective reality, through whose framework he perceives the natural world. Ideally, each scientist should become involved with an art, and each artist with a science. In that way, the intuitive and objective qualities would be merged, their separate abilities deepened, each one developing through its alliance with the other. Friday evening, February 18, 1977. If science does not enlarge its thematic and theoretical frameworks, young scientists will drop out, as in your time, priests are doing, and for the same reason. They sense that their training is dangerously lopsided. Taught to over-objectify, however, these scientists often overcompensate and become anti-science and anti-technology in their attitudes, advocating instead an equally exaggerated emphasis upon faith without reason. They are tired of academic competition and weary of protecting the ego against the onslaughts of Freud's subconscious instinctive drives. They want nothing so much as peace of mind, and so, often they fall prey to the theologies or systems that dismiss individualism and desire, offering a distorted concept of cosmic consciousness instead. All such a person must do is let go the emblems of his specieshood, the emotions, intellect, and the illusion of individuality. Such psychological policies contradict, of course, the basic concepts of political democracy. To many such people, not only is competition wrong, but work itself loses its value. Thusly, one exaggerated hypothesis leads to its opposite. There are, however, two main ways of relating to the phenomenal world, each quite natural to man, spiritually and biologically. One has generally been dominant since the birth of history. We react to events and to the environment using logical thought to interpret a reality that is understood to exist out there regardless of our perception of it. Thusly, an apple is an apple whether or not we see it or eat it. A road is a road whether or not we ever walk or drive upon it. The other approach, never to my knowledge fully followed, involves an identification with nature and events. Here we have the belief that thoughts and emotions not only have a direct effect upon matter, but direct events in some invisible or automatic fashion, a fashion that can be deduced, however, through trial and error. Using this method, man spies out and explores nature's inner workings by projecting his consciousness into it, not by examining it from the outside. This second method, I believe, is closely allied with natural creative functioning as it is displayed through the constant creation of cells in the body, and mentally apparent in the thought processes themselves and in the formation of the arts. This method is also active and involves the creative formation of events through a focusing of natural forces, with an intent or specific purpose in mind. The follower of such beliefs takes it for granted that these forces act spontaneously in ways that escape his knowing, as the writer takes it for granted that his conscious intent will evoke the creative processes which operate beneath his conscious knowledge, and thus result in a creative product. Since certain events are more probable than others in the phenomenal world, it is possible that such mental identification and focusing of intent is responsible for the experience of one specific event rather than another probable one. This mental and emotional force in man and nature meeting may represent the hidden depth perception science lacks in its own investigations. In my time, however, Darwinian and Freudian theories began to predominate, yet the nation held with almost equal vigor those rousing concepts of individual liberty, those hopes of man's good intent, that faith in God, man, and country that was expressed, though often simplistically, in each corner of the land. An almost athletic optimism resulted, at least for a while, and the belief that the human will could prevail against all odds. The more prevalent the Darwinian concepts became, the more they insinuated themselves into national thought, and the more insistent the nation's simple optimism became as it tried to counter the pessimistic trend. When Freudian psychology merged with Darwinian ideology, but more importantly, when psychology allied itself with Freud rather than Myers, then the balance fell sharply away from optimism. None of the every day and every way I'm getting better and better schools could effectively counter the darker theories that swiftly seized all of the academics of both medicine and science. Earlier, Protestantism and optimism merged with some uneasiness, but God's in his heaven and all is right with the world affirmations could not fit into the Darwinian survival theory. Briefly, the citizen could combine the two. If he was fairly prosperous and healthy, then he could see himself as Darwin's pride of the species and Protestantism's man of good works. Proof that God helps those who help themselves. But this alliance could not hold, for the Darwinian man could not have a soul. His murderous instincts left no room for honest good works, and Freudian man had no effective will, only the instinctive subconscious that reached backward through Darwinian time to the animal's savage nature. Most unfortunately, psychology followed that path, taking science and medicine with it. End. Thank you.